Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The house was filled with the scent of vanilla candles and freshly baked pastries, the kind of warmth and comfort that made celebrations feel special, the kind of atmosphere I had carefully curated to ensure that today was about joy, not stress, about family, not tension, about welcoming my child into a world where love was supposed to come without conditions. The decorations had taken me weeks to plan, pastel balloons floating lazily against the ceiling, delicate floral arrangements set along the tables, an overwhelming sense of softness and beauty that I had wanted for this day, for this moment, for the people who were supposed to be here to celebrate with me. I had convinced myself that this time would be different, that this time Diane, my mother-in-law, would not find a way to turn something beautiful into something bitter, that she would not seize control of the room with her passive-aggressive remarks and sharp smiles that hid knives beneath their edges. The guests had arrived in waves, warm hugs, and excited voices filling the air as friends and family brought gifts wrapped in pastel ribbons, their hands reaching instinctively toward my belly. Their words filled with sweetness as they talked about the baby as if he were already here, already a part of the world, already loved beyond measure. My husband, Ryan, had been moving through the room effortlessly, one arm draped casually around my waist whenever he passed by, pressing a reassuring squeeze against my back as if he could sense that beneath my smile, I was bracing myself for whatever was coming next. And then, as expected, Diane arrived, sweeping through the door in a flurry of perfume and carefully calculated enthusiasm, her voice just a little too loud, her laugh just a little too sharp, her eyes scanning the room in that way she always did, assessing, measuring, deciding who was worth her attention and who wasn't. She made her rounds with an air of practiced grace, complimenting the decorations in a tone that made it sound like she was surprised I had managed to pull off something so elegant, making a point to greet Ryan first before turning her gaze on me, her smile tight, her eyes holding that familiar glint of amusement, as if she were already preparing to say something that would make me wish I had never invited her in the first place. "Oh, Emma, sweetheart, you're absolutely glowing," she said, tilting her head slightly as her eyes flickered over me, lingering just a little too long, her voice carrying the kind of sugary sweetness that always preceded an insult dressed as a compliment. "And you've really filled out, haven't you? I suppose that's what happens when you're carrying a strong baby boy, it's all that extra weight, but don't worry, dear, some women bounce back quickly." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, their polite smiles faltering for just a second before they quickly turned their attention elsewhere, pretending not to hear. Pretending not to notice the way Diane had once again managed to slip a needle beneath my skin without anyone calling her out for it. Ryan, standing just a few feet away, only chuckled under his breath, shaking his head slightly as if to say that's just how she is, as if it were something I should have already learned to accept by now. I swallowed the sharp response sitting on the tip of my tongue, reminding myself that today was not about her, that she was not going to take this from me, not this time, not when I had spent so long making sure everything was perfect. I smiled instead, a carefully measured expression that didn't quite reach my eyes, nodding politely as if her words hadn't landed exactly the way she had intended them to. She wasn't finished. She never was. As the guests gathered around the beautifully decorated table, laughter and conversation filling the air, Diane positioned herself perfectly in the center of the attention, her voice cutting through the chatter effortlessly, her words loud enough to make sure everyone could hear her. "Well," she said, placing a delicate hand over her chest as if she were making an innocent observation, "I just hope the baby looks more like our side of the family." The words hit the air like a slap, lingering there for a second too long, sinking into the room like the first crack in an otherwise perfect surface. There was a moment of silence, the kind of moment where people weren't quite sure whether they should laugh, nod in agreement, or politely pretend they hadn't heard what had just been said. Ryan, who had been standing beside me, let out a quiet chuckle, but there was something different about it this time, something almost amused, but not in the way Diane had intended. He glanced at me for just a brief second, his eyes holding something I couldn't quite place, before turning his attention back to his mother, his smirk widening slightly as he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, folded envelope. "Funny you should say that, Mom," he said, his voice casual, almost too casual, the kind of tone that sent a ripple of unease through the air, making even those who had been pretending not to notice suddenly pay very close attention. "Because the DNA test results came in yesterday." The room went absolutely silent. All eyes turned toward him, then toward me, then back to him again, the weight of his words settling in the air like an unspoken question that no one quite knew how to respond to. Diane's smile, so smug just moments before, faltered ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass as she blinked, her expression shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible, almost. Ryan held the envelope between his fingers, tapping it lightly against his palm, his gaze steady, his smirk unwavering, his posture completely relaxed, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, as if he had known exactly what she was going to say long before the words had even left her mouth. And then, without breaking eye contact, without hesitating for even a second, he started to tear it open. The silence in the room stretched unbearably long, the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace or comfort, but from tension so thick it presses down on your chest, making it impossible to breathe properly. Every single guest had their eyes locked on Ryan, watching as his fingers slowly slid along the edge of the envelope, the anticipation crackling in the air like static before a storm. Diane, who had spent the last hour basking in her usual smugness, suddenly looked far less certain, her carefully applied smile faltering ever so slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her wine glass in a way that made her knuckles turn pale. I had seen that expression before, many times in fact, though never quite like this, not so exposed, not so raw, not so completely unmasked. It was the same look she had given me on my wedding day when Ryan had turned toward me with pure adoration in his eyes. The same look she had given me at our first Christmas together when he had chosen to sit beside me rather than take his usual seat next to her. The same look she had given me every single time I had unknowingly challenged the idea that I would always remain an outsider in her world. I hadn't even processed the full weight of what Ryan had just done, hadn't even begun to understand why he had ordered a DNA test in the first place, why he had felt the need to make a statement so bold, so unshakably final. In front of everyone we knew. My heart pounded, not in fear, but in a kind of surreal disbelief, a quiet chaos unraveling in my mind as memories flickered through me like a film reel spinning too fast. There had always been an unspoken rule in this family, one that I had learned early on, one that Diane had enforced with nothing more than well-placed words and well-timed glances. I had been tolerated but never truly welcomed, included but never embraced, acknowledged but never respected. I remembered our first Christmas together, sitting in this very house, the fireplace crackling in the background as Diane had passed out presents wrapped in expensive paper, her laughter ringing through the air like bells. She had handed Ryan his gift first, a sleek, leather-bound notebook that she had gushed about picking out just for him, something he could use at work, something that showed how well she knew him. She had given Sarah, Ryan's sister, a delicate gold bracelet, slipping it onto her wrist with a soft smile and an affectionate squeeze of the hand. And then there had been me, sitting on the couch beside Ryan, watching as she turned to me with an expression that held nothing but thinly veiled amusement, handing me a small, weightless bag. Inside had been a candle, cheap, unscented, impersonal, the kind of thing you grab last minute from a discount aisle when you suddenly remember you were supposed to buy something. "Oh, Emma," she had said, her voice dripping with forced warmth, "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I just picked up something simple. You seem like the kind of person who appreciates practical things." Ryan hadn't noticed, or if he had chosen not to acknowledge it, brushing it off the way he always did, the way everyone else in the family had learned to do, the way I had been expected to do. Now, as I sat at my own baby shower, staring at the man who had once told me his mother's approval didn't matter, I wondered what had changed, what had led him to this moment, What had made him feel the need to prove something so undeniably final? The envelope sat between his fingers like a loaded gun, something that had already been set in motion, something that could not be undone, no matter how badly Diane wished it could be. Diane's eyes flickered from the envelope to Ryan's face, something unreadable flashing behind them, a calculation happening in real time, the gears turning in her mind as she tried to regain control of the situation. Then, just as Ryan's fingers began to tear along the edge of the envelope, she let out a sharp laugh, too high-pitched, too forced, the sound cutting through the tension like a blade. "Oh, Ryan, come on," she said, her voice laced with something close to desperation, though she masked it well, her hands lifting in a gesture that was meant to appear lighthearted but fell flat. "This is so unnecessary." "You don't actually think," Ryan's jaw clenched, his smirk fading slightly as he cut her off with nothing more than a slight shake of his head. "Why would it be unnecessary, Mom?" he asked, his voice calm but firm, the kind of tone that left no room for argument, the kind I had rarely heard him use with her before. "You're the one who keeps making comments about genetics, about bloodlines, about whether the baby is going to look like your side of the family." He lifted the envelope slightly, making sure she saw it, making sure everyone saw it. "So I figured, why not be absolutely sure?" The blood drained from Diane's face so quickly it was almost dizzying to watch, her carefully crafted expression slipping for just a moment before she forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm that betrayed her nervous energy. "Ryan," she tried again, her voice softening, taking on that maternal tone she always used when she wanted to manipulate him into seeing things her way. "I just meant that family resemblance is important, that it's nice when a baby carries on tradition, when—" Ryan let out a quiet scoff, shaking his head as he finally tore the envelope open, unfolding the paper inside with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes scanning the words before glancing back up at his mother. The tension in the room became unbearable, a thick, suffocating presence that no one dared to break. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until I saw Diane's fingers twitch against her lap, her entire body rigid with something dangerously close to panic. I had expected her to be smug, to be amused, to have some sort of cruel retort lined up, but instead, she looked as if she had been backed into a corner she hadn't anticipated, as if this test, this moment, had suddenly become about something far more significant than she had originally intended. And that was when I knew. There was something she didn't want us to see. Ryan's eyes scanned the paper slowly, his expression unreadable, his fingers gripping the edges of the document so tightly that I could hear the faint crinkle of the paper beneath his hands. The silence in the room had stretched into something unbearable, something suffocating, something that made every single person present hesitate to even breathe too loudly, as if the air itself had become heavier with unspoken truths waiting to be revealed. I could feel my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, a steady, insistent rhythm that seemed to echo in the space between us, my pulse quickening with every passing second that Ryan remained silent, his gaze flickering back and forth across the words in front of him. I wanted to say something, to demand an explanation, to ask why he had even ordered the test in the first place, why he had chosen this moment, of all moments, to turn our baby shower into some kind of revelation that none of us had been prepared for. But the words caught in my throat, tangled in my uncertainty, in the gnawing feeling in my gut that told me this wasn't just about me, that this wasn't just about proving something to Diane, that there was something else, something deeper, lurking beneath the surface of this moment. And then, finally, Ryan's face changed, not in the way I had expected, not in relief or satisfaction, not in the smug triumph of proving a point, but in something far more unsettling. His skin paled, his jaw tightened, his lips parting slightly as if he wanted to say something but couldn't quite force the words out, his entire body stiffening as he slowly lifted his head, his eyes locking onto Diane with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "The baby is mine," he said, his voice quieter than I had anticipated, lacking the victorious edge I had been bracing for, his tone flat, almost distant, as if he were speaking more to himself than to the rest of the room. "There's no doubt about that." A breath I hadn't realized I was holding escaped my lips, my shoulders sagging slightly in relief. But before I could process that momentary reprieve, before I could even begin to understand what else was happening, I saw it, the way Diane's body tensed. The way her fingers curled so tightly against the tablecloth that her knuckles turned white, the way her chest rose and fell in uneven breaths as her eyes darted toward Ryan, wide and unblinking, like a deer caught in the path of oncoming headlights. She wasn't relieved. She wasn't smirking. She wasn't even pretending to be amused anymore. She was afraid. And that was when I knew this had never been about me. Ryan's hands trembled slightly as he lowered the paper to his side, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts, his entire demeanor shifting into something I had never seen before, something raw, something close to devastation. But this test, he continued, his voice still eerily quiet, as if he were struggling to keep himself steady, as if he were afraid of what might happen if he let the emotions rising inside him spill out unchecked. It also shows something else. Diane's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard, her jaw tightening as if she were trying to brace herself for impact, as if she had known this moment would come eventually, but had never expected it to arrive quite like this, in front of a room full of people. With no way to control the narrative, no way to spin the truth into something more palatable. "Ryan," she said finally, her voice unnaturally calm, a forced steadiness that did nothing to hide the sheer panic behind her eyes. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ryan let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly, his fingers tightening around the test results, his knuckles paling as his grip grew stronger, as if he needed to hold on to something solid in order to keep himself from spiraling. "You know exactly what I'm talking about," he said, his voice gaining an edge now. Something sharp, something dangerous, something that made the air in the room feel even heavier than before. I had never seen him look at her like that before, had never seen him regard his mother with anything other than love or, at worst, mild exasperation. But this was different. This was betrayal. This was realization crashing over him like a tidal wave, sweeping away whatever remained of the trust he had once placed in her, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of whatever truth had just been uncovered. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, my mind scrambling to make sense of the sudden shift, of the way Ryan was looking at his mother as if she were a stranger, as if he no longer recognized the woman who had raised him. "What else does it say?" Ryan's lips parted, but before he could speak, before he could tear open the fragile veil of silence that had settled over the room like a shroud, Diane surged forward, her chair scraping loudly against the floor as she reached for the paper in his hands. Her movements sharp, frantic, completely unlike the composed woman I had known for years. "Ryan, stop," she snapped, her voice breaking slightly at the edges, her hands shaking as she tried to grab at the test results, her panic no longer something she could contain, no longer something she could disguise behind carefully chosen words and forced smiles. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what." Ryan jerked away from her grasp, holding the paper just out of her reach, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the tension rippling through his neck, his eyes flashing with something dangerously close to rage. "Tell them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying more weight than if he had shouted it. Diane froze, her breath catching in her throat, her entire body going unnaturally still as she stared at him, something like horror flickering behind her eyes, something that told me, in that moment, that whatever this was, whatever she had been hiding, it was far worse than I had ever imagined. Ryan's gaze never wavered, never softened, never gave her an inch of space to escape from the truth that was closing in around her like a noose. "Tell them the truth," he said again, and this time there was no mistaking it. Whatever was about to come next, it was something that would change everything. The weight of Ryan's words still hung in the air, thick and suffocating, wrapping around the room like an invisible force that no one knew how to break. Diane remained frozen in place, her entire body unnaturally stiff, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to say something but couldn't quite figure out where to begin, as if any sentence she formed would only tighten the noose around her neck. The guests, who had initially shifted uncomfortably in their seats, now sat in absolute silence, their wide eyes darting between Diane, Ryan, and the crumpled DNA test in his hands, all of them too afraid to be the first to speak. I could feel my own breath coming in slow, steady waves, my heartbeat no longer frantic but controlled, a strange sense of clarity settling over me as I realized something that I should have understood a long time ago. Diane wasn't in control anymore. She could sit there with her spine straight and her chin lifted, pretending that she still held all the power in the room, but the truth was, the moment Ryan had opened that envelope, she had lost. Whatever she had been hiding, whatever lie she had built her entire world around, it had started to unravel, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. I could see it in the way her fingers twitched against the tablecloth, in the way her gaze darted toward the exit as if she were considering whether she could simply get up and leave, in the way her breath hitched every time Ryan shifted, even slightly in his seat, as if she were waiting for him to speak again, to deliver another blow that she might not be able to recover from. But he didn't. Ryan remained silent, his eyes fixed on the paper in his hands, his expression unreadable, his mind clearly racing with possibilities that he hadn't even considered before tonight. He had always trusted Diane, always defended her when I pointed out the subtle ways she undermined me, always brushed off her manipulations as quirks rather than calculated moves designed to keep him tethered to her. But now, for the first time since I had known him, he was looking at her as if she were a stranger, as if he were seeing her for who she truly was rather than who he had always wanted her to be. The realization sent a slow, burning satisfaction through me, not the kind that came from anger or bitterness, but the kind that came from finally knowing that I didn't have to fight for him to see it anymore. He saw it on his own. He saw her now. Diane must have sensed it too, because after what felt like an eternity of silence, she finally drew in a sharp breath, shaking her head slightly as if trying to compose herself, her voice coming out in a forced, airy laugh that didn't fool anyone. "Well," she said, her tone artificially light, though I could hear the underlying tremor beneath it, "this has all been a very dramatic misunderstanding, hasn't it?" She gave a small, tight-lipped smile, her fingers smoothing over the tablecloth as if the gesture could erase the tension lingering in the air. "I really don't know why you're making such a fuss over a silly little test, Ryan. It's completely unnecessary. You know who you are, and you certainly know where you come from." Ryan lifted his head slowly, his expression darkening, his fingers tightening around the paper once more, but before he could respond, I leaned forward slightly, letting my voice cut through the quiet in a way that made Diane's entire body go rigid. "Oh, I agree, Diane," I said, keeping my tone deliberately soft, my lips curving into a pleasant smile that I knew would unnerve her more than outright confrontation ever could. DNA tests can be so unnecessary sometimes. I mean, you've spent so much time worrying about bloodlines, making sure this baby looks like the right side of the family. I tilted my head slightly, letting my smile widen just enough to be unsettling. "But I have to wonder, have you ever questioned your own?" Diane's face drained of what little color remained, her carefully constructed mask slipping for the briefest of moments before she forced it back into place, but it was too late. I had seen the flicker of raw panic behind her eyes, the tightening of her throat as she swallowed hard, the slight tremor in her hands as she reached for her wine glass and took a long, deliberate sip, as if the action would steady her, as if she could simply will herself into believing that she still had control over this conversation. But she didn't. And we both knew it. Ryan was watching her closely now, his breathing slow and measured, his mind working through every detail, every possibility, every moment in his life that had ever felt off, but that he had dismissed because he had never thought to question his mother. And I could see it, the exact second when the doubt truly began to take root in his mind, when the possibility of what I was implying started to take shape, twisting into something undeniable. The room remained deathly quiet, the other guests too afraid to move, too afraid to even react, as if they had become nothing more than spectators in something they shouldn't have been witnessing. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. I leaned back in my chair, still smiling, still holding Diane's gaze as she stared at me with barely contained fury, knowing she couldn't lash out, knowing she couldn't challenge me without risking revealing too much. And that was the beauty of it. She was trapped now, forced to sit in her own discomfort, knowing that I had planted the first seed of doubt, knowing that it would only grow larger from here. Ryan inhaled deeply, his jaw tightening, his fingers twitching slightly as if resisting the urge to pull out his phone and start searching for answers immediately. "Mom," he finally said, his voice calm but firm, carrying the weight of 1,000 questions that he wasn't ready to ask yet. "What are you telling me?" And for the first time in her life, Diane had no answer. The silence stretched so thick and suffocating that it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room entirely, leaving nothing but the sound of shallow, uneven breathing and the occasional nervous shifting of guests who clearly wished they were anywhere else but here. Diane hadn't moved from her chair, her posture unnaturally stiff, her fingers curled so tightly around the stem of her wine glass that I half expected it to shatter beneath the pressure. Her carefully constructed mask of poise and control was beginning to crumble at the edges, the cracks in her perfect exterior spreading faster than she could repair them, and for the first time since I had met her, she looked afraid. Ryan sat motionless beside me, the DNA results still clutched tightly in his hand, his knuckles white from the force of his grip, his expression unreadable as his gaze remained locked onto his mother with a quiet intensity that made my skin prickle. He was processing everything, working through the implications of what I had just said, sorting through memories he had likely never questioned before, but were now taking on an entirely new, unsettling meaning. The tension in the room was unbearable, a thick, invisible force pressing down on all of us, and yet I refused to look away from Diane, refused to give her even a second to regain her footing, refused to let her rewrite the narrative before the truth had a chance to sink in. I could feel the shift happening in real time, the moment when the power that Diane had wielded so effortlessly for years was slipping through her fingers like sand, the moment when she realized she no longer had control over the people in this room, no longer had control over her own carefully curated image, no longer had control over the truth that was about to destroy everything she had spent her life trying to build. Ryan finally inhaled sharply, breaking the suffocating stillness, his voice low and steady but laced with something dangerously close to anger. "Mom," he said, the word barely more than a whisper, but heavy with meaning, filled with the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions, 1,000 unexamined moments, 1,000 doubts that he had never allowed himself to consider before. "What are you telling me?" Diane blinked rapidly, her lips parting as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, she was at a loss, struggling to find a way out of the corner she had backed herself into, struggling to come up with an excuse, an explanation, anything that could salvage the mess she had created. But there was no way out. Not this time. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice soft, deliberate, laced with just enough amusement to make it clear that I wasn't simply seeking answers. I was making a point, exposing her for the hypocrite she had always been. "You've spent so much time worrying about genetics, Diane," I said, tilting my head slightly as I studied her, watching the flicker of panic behind her carefully guarded expression. "So much time making sure that this baby looked like the right side of the family, so much time making sure I understood my place here. But I have to wonder." I paused just long enough to let the tension build, to let her feel the weight of the words before I delivered the final blow. "Have you ever questioned your own?" The reaction was instant and undeniable. Diane's breath caught in her throat, her body going rigid as the color drained from her face, her perfectly applied makeup unable to conceal the sheer panic flashing across her features. Her fingers trembled slightly against the table, her eyes darting toward Ryan in a silent, desperate plea, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was staring down at the paper in his hands, his brow furrowing, his lips parting slightly as realization dawned over him like a slow-moving storm. "No," he said suddenly, his voice almost too soft to hear, his eyes scanning the results again, searching for something, anything, that could disprove the thought forming in his mind. "That's not possible." He exhaled sharply, his gaze snapping back to Diane with something dangerously close to disbelief, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. "Tell me this is a mistake." Diane didn't answer. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink as the weight of Ryan's words settled between them like a chasm too wide to cross. The room had fallen into absolute silence, the kind of silence that only came when something irreversible had been spoken aloud, when something that could never be undone had finally surfaced. Ryan's expression darkened, his voice growing louder now, more demanding, more desperate. "Tell me this isn't real," he snapped, shoving the paper toward her as if forcing her to look at it would somehow change the words written on the page. "Tell me that this thing that I'm looking at isn't saying what I think it's saying." Still, Diane said nothing. Her silence was the only answer he needed. Someone let out a sharp gasp, breaking the thick tension, and I could feel the shift in the air as the other guests began to understand the full weight of what was happening, as whispers began to ripple through the room like shockwaves, as the truth, undeniable, unavoidable, settled in. Ryan wasn't her biological son. Diane, the woman who had spent her entire life obsessing over bloodlines and legacy and making sure that her family name remained pure, had been hiding the biggest secret of all. Everything she had built, everything she had preached, everything she had used to tear me down, to belittle me, to make me feel like I would never truly belong in this family, it had all been a lie. And in that moment, as Diane sat there, completely shattered, completely exposed, completely powerless for the first time in her life, I felt something inside me settle, something that had been twisting in my chest for years, finally unraveling, finally setting me free. I pushed my chair back slowly, rising to my feet with deliberate ease, smoothing my hands over my dress as I glanced around at the stunned faces surrounding me. I didn't need to say anything else, didn't need to drive the knife in any deeper than it already was, didn't need to do anything other than what I had come here to do, walk away with my head held high, knowing that Diane would never recover from this moment. As I reached for my coat, pausing just long enough to meet her wide, desperate eyes one last time, I let a small, satisfied smile curve at the edges of my lips. "Merry Christmas, Diane," I said, my voice light, almost cheerful, as I turned toward the door, leaving her to sit in the ruins of her own deception. And this time, I didn't look back.